Temperatures today, partly sunny with a high of 85 to 87, partly cloudy tonight, low 67 to 71. Then look for thick cloud cover on Friday with a shower in the area and a high of 76 to 86. Saturday will have plenty of sunshine, but a cooler day with a high of 63 to 69. From the Florida Weather Center, I'm Holly Holdren.
Calling all veterans. Are you interested in making a change in your life? Well, the Veteran Small Farm and Business Incubator Program is for you. This tuition-free training provides resources to start your business in agriculture or allied services. Who is eligible? All veterans and their family members who live in the state of Florida. For details, call 954-434-8220. Again, 954-434-8220.
This week's Veterans News is being sponsored in part by the North-South Institute Veteran Small Farm and Business Incubator Program, which provides practical training and support for Florida veterans who are interested in launching their own agricultural business or gain full employment. A veteran is anyone who has served in the branch of the U.S. military and has received their DD Form 214. To register, call 954-434-8220 to apply, or email mcook@nsied.org. Again, to register, call 954-434-8220 to apply, or email mcook@nsied.org. Veterans News is also brought to you by Hires Baxley Funeral Service and Highland Memorial Park. Hires Baxley has a generation of families, honors them with their trust and confidence. They believe it's because for the last 128 years, their team of caring professionals have established a reputation of serving families with excellence and compassion. Hires Baxley currently partners with the Boy Scouts of America, Troop Number 72, to properly dispose of decommissioned American flags. They are also a drop-off location for the program's Cell Phones for Soldiers, helping to provide minutes that matter and helping heroes home. Hires Baxley is located at 910 East Silver Springs Boulevard in Ocala. You can call them with questions at 352-629-7171, or they can be found at hires-baxley.com. Veterans News is also brought to you by Bob Wine's Camellia Gardens and Nursery at 2610 Southeast 38th Street in Ocala. When it comes to landscaping, Bob Wines has what you need. Everything from small plants to large trees, mulch, fertilizer, and so much more. Bob Wines will even deliver plant and guarantee their trees. Bob Wine's Camellia Garden and Nursery has been keeping you blooming since 1952. Give them a call at 352-629-5766. Bob Wines also offers a 10% discount to any veteran. That's right, it's Veterans News. And in the studio today, it is the third week of the month, so that means that the good folks from the VA clinics in Gainesville and Ocala are joining us. Dr. Jose Torres Rodriguez, he's the chief medical officer here in Ocala, and Terry McLean, she is a nurse practitioner up in Gainesville. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Doctor, go ahead. You get us started with where we're going today.
All right. So the topic for today is going to be about advanced directive, palliative care, a little bit of hospice definition, life-sustaining orders. What is the definition of that, or what that means, when an order is in place. So with us this morning is Ms. Terry McLean, and she's going to talk more about the topic. So Ms. McLean.
Hi, my name is Terry McLean. I'm a nurse practitioner with the Palliative Care team. I'm under Dr. Sani, who's the chief of geriatric and extended care medicine of all of North Florida and South Georgia. And my immediate director is Dr. Rich, who's the director of hospice and palliative care for North Florida, South Georgia. I work with a palliative care team, which just means that we have an interdisciplinary team of chaplains, psychology, nursing, and physicians, and we are a supportive service for any veteran who finds themselves with a serious life medical condition, and we just support them in any way we can. But today, we specifically are going to talk about the importance of having an advance directive and what we call is a life-sustaining treatment note on your chart so that your wishes are known when you are in a situation where you can't speak for yourself. So basically, who would you trust to speak for you, and what medical decisions would you want them to make for you if that ever happened?
That usually, like, when I think about that, the first question is my significant other. That would be the person that I would want to be that person. But that's not always the case.
No, that's not always the case, and that's important. And can I give you two stories of my experience with the palliative care team? And they're two pretty common stories. There was a time I met a gentleman named Mike. And Mike was in his 70s, and he had struggled since he was about 14 years old with substance abuse issues, alcohol and substance abuse issues that had caused a divorce and estrangement from his only biological daughter. And so he had had decades without any connection to these two people, and he'd been living with his mother, and when I met him, his mother was in his 90s. Well, one day, his mother walked in and found Mike on the floor, unconscious, with a contusion to his head and blood all over the floor. And so she called 911, and he ended up in the hospital. They had to intubate him. He was struggling with the breathing tube going down his throat. He had pulled it out numerous times. He ended up sedated and restrained. And his mother, who was very distraught, as you can imagine, a woman in her 90s seeing her child like this, made some very difficult decisions. She decided that Mike would not want to be intubated, and that she would like, if he were to survive the breathing tube being removed, she would like him to go to a hospice care center. So she makes these decisions only to find out that actually Mike's biological daughter is the one who is legally obligated to make the decision about his medical treatment, or to say that his mother could make those decisions. So the hospital has to do their due diligence to find the daughter, and they could, with the miracle of Facebook, they could actually find the daughter, but the daughter was refusing to respond to any phone calls from family or the hospital. So as a result, an ethics committee had to be assembled. The ethics committee is at every hospital, and it contains, all the many disciplines like the ones I already mentioned: chaplains, psychologists, physicians, nursing, and they decide what's the ethical choice for the veteran. And it turned out to be that his mother should make his decisions, and she was able then to ask for the breathing tube to be removed. He survived that. He was able to go to a hospice care center where he lived about 48 hours. It was enough time for a brother to come from another state. And when I talked to his mother, her name was Peggy, afterwards she said that they had, really nice time for about 12 hours. He was conscious again. He joked a little bit, and he passed away then peacefully. But unfortunately, there were about 5 days in the ICU where no one knew what to do for Mike, and his mother was struggling. And that didn't have to happen. So none of us know when we might have an accident, but it's important to have these decisions on the chart. So that's one story. And a lot of us might think, well, I'll never be in that situation. I don't have alcohol and substance abuse issues. I have a will. I've got everything under control. So I'm going to tell you another story. It's also a typical story of a veteran. He's a Korean-era veteran who had a long career. He was an engineer. He worked with locomotives and then with jet engines, and he was very much in control and very successful. He was also proud and independent, like a lot of our veterans are. And so when he realized he had esophageal cancer, he didn't want to talk to his children about that. The main reason he didn't want them to know was because he wanted to live alone. He didn't want to have to leave the state and live with one of his children. A lot of people feel that way. So as a result, he didn't tell them that he had cancer, and he did have a will, and he did have a living will that said what he would want, and he did have his surrogates named. And he had done this with an attorney, and it was in a nice leather-bound notebook in his home. So one day, this veteran's name was Howard, his cancer progressed to a tumor was blocking his stomach, between his stomach and his intestines, which meant nothing could go through. So he was vomiting bile. He's very uncomfortable. He drove himself to the hospital. But of course, he didn't bring that leather-bound book to say what should happen to him. So he was put on artificial nutrition. He was very confused. He was put on artificial nutrition going through his veins and hydration. He was being considered for a gastric tube to help drain that stomach acid, which the medical people didn't really want to do because it's invasive, and he was going to die within weeks of his cancer anyway. So in the meantime, they had a tube down his nose that was decompressing all that stomach acid. That's called a NG tube, and it's not very comfortable. And he was wanting to pull that out. He was also had to be sedated and restrained for that. So eventually, his children, who were out of state, learned of the situation. They also had copies of the will, which is wonderful. They were able to fax those to the hospital. They were signed, and they were able to get to him. He didn't get the G tube. They took out the NG tube so that he was more comfortable. They got him to hospice, no restraints, no sedation. And then he, too, was able to spend a few days with his children peacefully in the hospice setting. But unfortunately, there was a delay again of that care. So what we're trying to do today is just to make all veterans aware that it's important to talk to your primary care team and make sure that your advance directive is up to date with the social worker. And the advance directive consists of who would speak for you if you couldn't speak for yourself. That would be, we call that a healthcare surrogate. And it can be anyone that you trust, and it's somebody that you have spoken to, and let them know. You have to have a hard decision with them and make sure they know what you would want. And it also includes what specific procedures you would want or would not want towards the end of your life. And all of those things can be changed, but it's good to have at least a starting point. And then almost more importantly is something called a life-sustaining treatment note that is also entered in the chart. And this has to be entered by your physician, a nurse practitioner, or a physician's assistant. And they basically confirm what's in your advance directive with the addition of your, what we call your code status, which would be as if your heart would stop, would you want to have chest compressions to restart your heart?
You know, the amazing, as you're sitting here listening, as I'm sitting here listening to you talk to tell these stories, my father, who was a veteran, he was brutally murdered in Jacksonville, but he lived for 6 days after the beating.
Wow.
And succumbed to his injuries. And if he'd had something like this, they'd have known where my mother was to contact her, because they were divorced at the time, but she was still listed as his emergency contact and all.
Yeah.
But they didn't know this at the hospital because all that was in the room he was renting and everything. But there was no will. Yeah. There was no DNR or anything like that. There was nothing like this. And literally, my mother didn't find out about even the attack happening or that he was in the hospital till after he passed away.
Yeah.
So he spent that entire 6 days of suffering and with this head trauma and everything, and nobody knew to contact his family or anything because he didn't. As I was sitting here listening to you, I was starting to get angry.
Yeah.
Because I'm sitting and I was starting to get angry at my dad, and And I think he did it out of ignorance. He didn't do it because he purposely wanted to deny us access. He just didn't know that he should have these kind of things in place.
Yeah, and a lot of people just assume the
The VA,
hospital knows
they
that.
know it. Yeah,
but
you got
they
my
really
records.
don't. Yeah, and
Correct.
your dad represents 70% of the veterans in the United States. 70% don't have these things listed in their chart, or they're not accurate.
It is why my mother, who was not a veteran, but that one incident was why my mother made sure before she got to where she was ill and helped, and she died from COPD, congestive heart failure from COPD,
Yeah.
which I don't wish that on anybody, by the way.
Yeah.
But she had a DNR in place. She had a living will in place. She had a will in place. I was the executor. Everybody knew it. I had a copy. Both my sisters had a copy. Her doctor, her primary care physician, had a copy.
Yeah.
By the time we put her in a assisted living facility, she lived there. They had a copy.
Yeah.
So everybody was on the same page.
Yeah.
But we wouldn't have known to do that if we hadn't have went through the horror of not knowing my father was in the situation he was in till after he had passed.
Yeah, and what you described is exactly what most civilians need. They need lots of copies, and they have to make sure everybody around them knows everything. And that's always good for a veteran, too. But unlike a regular civilian, veterans have the VA system, and we have durable power of attorneys, which means when you choose that person to speak for you and you have that registered in your VA chart, that goes to any VA.
Right.
So, yeah, it
doesn't go
wouldn't
to
be the
as a
same
civilian.
for-
It doesn't go to any hospital.
Right.
The fact that her
doesn't go
primary
between
care
hospitals.
her primary care physician had it. The hospital when she got taken to the hospital when she fell and hit her head.
Yeah.
And that's what started the downfall with my mother when she fell and hit her head. Because we found her and we got the ambulance, we were able to go to the hospital with all her paperwork, give it to the emergency room doctors.
Yep.
Here's what you have to do, the emergency room doctor. Because when they started in, they were like, she was not responsive or anything originally. And they were like, well, we got to do this. We got to do intubate. And I go, no. Here's the folder. There's a DNR in here. If she codes or anything, she's supposed to just drift to go.
Yeah.
And we had that because of the incident we had with my father earlier.
Yeah.
That we were just dumbfounded that 6 days after the fact, they still hadn't contacted. And the VA knew who my mom was.
Yeah.
My mom had been on the record and everything, but because they didn't have the wishes of dad,
Yeah.
and mom and him were divorced,
Right.
the VA was like, well, we didn't know, we didn't have any paperwork saying to contact the estranged wife.
Yeah, that is exactly right. Because if you go by the state of Florida, if somebody doesn't have someone designated, first it is the spouse. But if the spouse is an ex-spouse, then they have to be specifically
Right,
named.
yeah.
Right. Otherwise, they're no longer on the list. And then it goes to adult children, and then to their own parents.
And none of
it
us
goes
were
down
adult
from
children at the time. We were all. My older sister was an adult, but she wasn't my father's child. She was his stepdaughter.
Yeah.
So I was at the time 17, and my sister at the time was 14. So they would not contact us either
Wow.
because we were kids.
Right.
And they contacted his brother in Wisconsin, or they tried to, but they could never get in touch with his brother in Wisconsin. So for 6 days, he just laid there. And the one thing in my life that that I deal with is, what did he know during that 6 days, and did he sit there and suffer for 6 days without his family being there?
Correct.
Yeah.
And that eats at me on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And this was 34, 35, 17 to 54, a long time ago. I can't do the math. It was a long time ago.
That's exactly why each of us needs to have those conversations with our loved ones and designate them so that they're not tormented later.
Yes.
Yeah.
And an important thing is that every time you go to your clinic, make sure your name, your address, your phone number, your contacts are up to date. Because sometimes we find that the number is not working, or the number is disconnected, or the emergency contacts are deceased, or they're not they don't want them as an emergency contact anymore because they're divorced or separated or.
That's a good rule of thumb. Anytime you go into the VA, make sure your contact list is up to date. Right.
Yeah, and very often a veteran might be cared for more by a grandchild, but they're not going to
100%.
come. They're not going to show up as the next of kin. It might be a brother in Wisconsin, and they haven't talked to for months. So
Correct.
it's really important.
Yeah, my father, if he'd have kept up with that, he'd have done it right. He had very close friends in the Jacksonville area that he could have used as next of kin or something like that. Not next of kin, but that he would have put on the list. But he didn't know to do that. And this was, the early 80s. We've come a long way with technology and a long way with informing people what they need to do. A lot of people back then, wills were something that the rich people did. If you were middle class or lower income, you ain't got nothing to give away anyway. What do you need a will for? Everybody, I think what you're trying to impress, though, is everybody needs to take these steps.
And it doesn't have to cost anything.
Right.
So you can get your advance directive correctly documented on your chart for no cost at all. You don't need a notary. You can just do it with your social worker at your primary care, and that would tell them who you trust to speak for you, how to contact them, and then what you might want. We call them life-sustaining treatments if, for instance, you ended up in an ICU situation. And some of us won't want to make those decisions yet. Maybe you just want to have that conversation with your with the person you choose to speak for you, and you say, in this situation, I would want this, but if it were this situation, I would want something different. They just have to know what you would want.
Right, because when I was with the living will and everything, when it came to DNR, I knew my mother because she had already been 3 different times. They had brought her back from the brink. She was like, I don't want to do that anymore. So then she signed the DNR, and I was aware of it and everything. But, somebody in their 40s is doing this for the first time. They may not want a DNR in their folder.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I still got a lot at 54, I still got a lot of life to live. I may not want a DNR if I get, if I get in a bad accident, try to save me. Now, if I'm 84 and I get in a bad accident or something, I go, if it gets too invasive, a DNR.
Yeah.
I can see how that changes over the years.
It changes.
And that leads back to what you said, Doctor. You need to update your file every time. Make sure it's up to date as it can be.
Yeah. They can just ask for a copy of a printout of the demographics. They can review them, stay there in the clinic, and if you have any changes, write them down, and the clerical staff, they can change that the same day. No, without an issue.
We always think about changing our address and our phone number, but we never think about changing. Because I went to the doctor, funny story, went to the doctor 2 days ago, and I hadn't been to the doctor in 2 years. But I went back to my primary care physician, first time in 2 years, and he asked me, is all your contact information up to date, most up to date? And I looked at it and I go, well, no, I broke up with her 3 years ago.
Right.
So my emergency contact on my folder was somebody that I hadn't spoken to in over 3 years.
Correct.
Yep, happens all the time.
Yeah.
Happens all the time. And another thing that's you kind of brought up the idea of wanting to change your mind. Some people are reluctant to name someone who would speak for them if they couldn't speak for themselves, but they need to really pay attention to that last part. It only counts if you cannot speak for yourself.
Right.
So if you have what we call capacity, if you can make your own decisions, you can change your mind at any time. And even though there's somebody listed there as your healthcare surrogate, they don't override you.
No, if you have your faculties and you decide, no, I do want to be resuscitated. I don't want a DNR, Well, if you're sitting there and going, hey, if this gets real bad, I know that I know it says that if it gets to the point where I need to be resuscitated, I don't want to. I just had my daughter just had a new grandchild. I want to be resuscitated. As long as you're within your faculties, you're still in charge of your health care.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
We're talking with Dr. Jose Torres Rodriguez. He's the Chief Medical Officer at the VA clinic here in Ocala. And Terry McLean, she is a nurse practitioner at the VA in Gainesville, Florida. If you have any questions for him, 622-9622 is the number to call. For any questions you may have concerning this kind of care, because this is something I think a lot of people don't realize that is of vital importance for some serious decision making that has to happen sometimes with healthcare. And if you're not capable of making that decision, you need to have documentation that says who is capable of making that decision or what that decision is. If you don't have anybody, you have it written what your decision was before you got incapacitated. We're going to take a time out. When we come back, we'll have more with Dr. Jose Torres Rodriguez and Terry McLean right here on Veterans News. You're listening to it on 1370 AM, 96.3 FM. This is WOCA, The Source.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
USA Radio News with Lance Pry.
Texas officials warned of disasters within the disaster of historic cold weather that left millions without heat for a third day Wednesday, telling residents to prepare for energy not to return until the weekend. Residents in over 100 counties in Texas have been told to boil their drinking water as treatment plants continue to not work. According to testimony by military leaders before the House Armed Services Committee on Wednesday, troops are putting off receiving the coronavirus vaccine. Big Brass told Congress about 2/3 of service members have been vaccinated, but some refuse the treatment. Officials said refusal rates varied and depended on factors like age, location, and deployment status. CDC data published Thursday shows life expectancy in the United States fell by